welcome again to the Week in Focus and to Sid Caudle. And we've got well, it's over to you, Sid. The local elections were interesting.
Yes, I think it's very clear that people have turned against the Conservative Party, but it's also very interesting that the Muslims have turned against the Labour Party, because both the Greens and the Lib Dems voted for a ceasefire in Gaza right from the beginning, voted to support Hamas, which quite honestly surprised me. It shocked me. I mean, the fact that the Lib Dems have basically positioned themselves now to the left of the Labour Party is like quite shocking. And it's quite clear that a large number of Muslims voted for Lib Dems and Greens, and the Lib Dems ended up with more councillors gained in this election than the Conservatives did. More councillors elected, I mean, in these local elections than the Conservatives did, which is, I don't think that's ever happened before.
Yeah, surprising times, lots coming out of this. And well, the word chaos springs to mind, Sid. We're in a right pickle. You can start looking at the quality of the MPs we have now. It's not like it used to be at all. And it's going to get worse when Labour get back in with a mega majority, because they're going to get so many from universities without any experience in the real world. We've got two serious parties, whether we like it or not. That's first past the post, always has been. Then analysing it, we've got the Lib Dems, who goodness knows where they are. They've never been anywhere for a decade or so, but now they're completely lost. And then it's identity politics from here on in. You've got SNPs, they want to become independent. You've got the Greens, who want to kill us all. I mean, it goes on and on. You've got the George Galloways. You've got the Muslims. That is a real threat. We've got to take notice of that, Sid.
Yeah, you see, what's very clear is that the Muslims have a very strong sense of identity, and I'm quite sure that the imams in the mosques tell their people how to vote and what to do. The Christians are all over the place. I mean, we did very badly, I'm afraid. I mean, our aim was to get somebody onto the London Assembly with a minimum of 100,000 votes. We ended up with only about 27,000, which was very disappointing. But Reform UK basically got the votes that we wanted. They got 145,000 votes and they got somebody elected. So they basically achieved what we were aiming to achieve. But in contrast, Reform UK have had massive of publicity. I mean, they've been on GB News almost daily, whereas we've not been on a single time. I mean, it's like the contrast is just phenomenal. And the Heritage Party, which just started recently, I mean, they got about 4,000 votes, so they did far worse than we did. I mean, almost wiped out, frankly. I mean, really, that party's almost ceased to exist, but they've been on GB News. They've had more publicity than we've had.
They're a young party, Sid, aren't they? David Curtin's only been going a few years.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, if you only get 4,000 votes from the whole of London, I'm afraid, I mean, it just shows that the party's just going nowhere. I mean, they're going backwards. I mean, when he stood last time for London Mayor, he only got about 13,000 votes, but to go from 13,000 to 4,000, I mean, that's a pretty drastic reduction. But it shows the party is decreasing rather than increasing. It's a problem, really, because if you've got a party like the Heritage Party, it's like, what do they stand for? At least with the Christian People's Alliance, people know what we stand for. I mean, there's no ambiguity about it. It's like, we don't, it's like everyone knows what the Greens stand for. People know what Reform UK stand for because of their connections with the Brexit Party. So people are very clear. Yeah, in fact, I think they're now including Brexit as part of their title, so people know that the Reform UK party exists in order to fight for all the reforms that were promised through Brexit. I mean, that's what they exist for.
And Sid, you were almost blaming yourself a minute ago. for your performance? Should you not be blaming the electorate, maybe, because they have moved away from Christian values like a stampede?
No, I blame the churches. You see, the problem is that the churches are frightened of the Charities Commission. The Charities Commission go around telling the churches, if you support any political party, you'll lose your charitable status. Yet mosques have charitable status, and mosques are telling people how to vote, but they're not frightened of the Charities Commission. It may be that the Charities Commission lay off them anyway, but you see, the message of the early church was that they were dragged before councils, they were dragged before kings, they were put in prison, but their response was, God, give us more boldness. I mean, they weren't frightened by the attacks from the authorities. And if the church is frightened by the attacks from the authorities because they might lose their charitable status, and that's what dictates their behavior, then they're in the wrong place. The whole church is in the wrong place. The church has got to get a backbone and to rise up and say, these are the values we're standing for. You know, we're not going to support anybody that doesn't support these values, and these are the values we're getting behind. That's where the church needs to be, and it's not where the church is now, frankly.
Well, this is an important question, and the church is divided over this. Half the church will say, we should have nothing to do with politics. Jesus didn't have anything to do with politics. He could have gone into politics big time with all the things that were happening 2,000 years ago, but he didn't. We are called to preach the gospel. And then the other 50% will say, no, we've got to be salt. We've got to stick our head above the parapet. And if we see something gravely wrong, or even just wrong in politics, we should say so, call it out. Which camp are you?
Well, obviously, I'm somebody that says we've got to be involved. But you see, the thing is, that they put over the cross when Jesus was crucified, the King of the Jews. And it was like Jesus said, my authority is not from the world. My authority is from God. That doesn't mean he didn't have authority. And it doesn't mean that he hasn't given us authority. I mean, my book is all authority over the nations, God and politics. God wants us to be in that place of authority. And in order to get into the place of authority, we have to win elections. That's the way it works. And it's quite interesting. I mean, we had a dramatic case of some Muslim elected somewhere. I don't even know where it was, frankly. I've not looked into it in detail. All I know is that after the victory in an election, they were yelling, Allahu Akbar, their Allah is great. It's like, okay, now that came through an election. Now, if it's Christians, we say, we're not going to be involved in elections. We're not going to get our hands dirty. We're just going to go to church and pray and preach the gospel. That's all we're going to do. We're frankly missing out on a very important part of the call that God has given to us. You see, some people talk about the 7 mountains of influence, business, education, media, as well as government politics. All these mountains of influence are where Christians need to be in order to change society. I mean, I'm massively keen on revival. I believe in revival. I believe that this is what God is calling us to, a place where he is ruling and he is reigning. And in revival, society is changed. Whole of society is changed, not just the church.
Well, the whole of society has changed, Sid. And back to the Muslim issue, potential is, well, it's here. It's not potential in one way or another. But we've mentioned on a number of occasions, and other commentators have as well, that half the Muslims in the United Kingdom want a caliphate. And that's been clearly proved by a number of surveys. Well, 2 points of view again here. One would say, well, what they're doing in the country, if they want to take over the country, introduce Sharia law, whatever they want to do. Another is to say, well, we've got to integrate. Not much sign of integration, Sid.
No, I mean, Islam is all about taking over. And as I said before, I've come to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, I mean, I'm not 100% certain, but I'm becoming of the opinion that all this immigration that's taking place all over the world. I mean, it's not just in Britain. I mean, it's rabid in the United States. It's rabid all over Europe. I mean, these people coming over are Muslims, and it shocks me because you would think that they would be Christians who were fleeing persecution, who were like coming over looking for a Christian country where they can find refuge, but they're not. The Christians are largely staying put, suffering, as basically as Christians are taught to, you know, for the sake of the gospel, and they're not fighting back physically. They're just basically seeking to humbly serve the Lord in the nation that they're called to serve. But we've got all these massive Muslim immigration taking place, or massive Muslim migration taking place all over the world. So why is it taking place? Why are Muslims leaving countries like Turkey, for instance? I mean, it's interesting. I was just told the other day, one of the nations that a lot of Muslims are coming from is Turkey. Well, there's no persecution in Turkey. I mean, of Muslims. I mean, there may be a bit of persecution of Christians, but there's no persecution of Muslims. There's no poverty in Turkey that they have to flee from. There's no war that they have to flee from. So why are they leaving? I think it's a deliberate attempt to try and make the West Muslim. Simple.
Well, yes, indeed. There's evidence to show that. The average person in the United Kingdom is actually now saying, well, clearly it's economic migration. They're not fleeing from anything. But there's a big lobby in the United Kingdom. You've mentioned the Lib Dems, certainly from them and other progressive groups that are clearly saying, well, they've got every right to better themselves. Really? Well, what about the people, the indigenous people in the United Kingdom? Are they supposed to welcome the world that have not paid any income tax, any national insurance, who've paid to keep the NHS going? What rights have they got? And you mentioned it, which is true. It affects many parts of the world, especially Europe. But I'll tell you what, we've got the most inefficient system and the most laid-back, laissez-faire system. And that's why they're crowding into Britain more than anywhere else, because we will give them anything they want. You don't get this in Belgium. You don't even get it in Germany.
Well, I mean, the truth is that Germany's got a bigger problem of migration than we've got. I mean, they're talking about net migration of 1.2 million over the last year. I mean, which is a phenomenal number of people. And in fact, I heard the other day that the Muslims were declaring a caliphate in Germany. They're literally trying to take over the country. Now, obviously, Germany is now ruled by socialists, and socialists have this open border philosophy, which Biden has. When Biden came into power, one of the first things he said was no one will be sent back from the United States. So once you make that proclamation, no one will be sent back, that's like an invitation for anyone that can get across the border can remain in the United States. And it's not surprising that millions, literally 5 million, have crossed the border during Biden's time. But if you have a deliberate policy of open borders, which was absolutely Hillary Clinton's policy, it's absolutely the Democrat policy, then people are going to come in large numbers. But if you've got a situation where there is a philosophy, which is the Islamic philosophy, that wants to take over the West, and they also have a philosophy of having as many children as you can possibly have, so they encourage their people to have 10, 11, 12 children. Whereas in Western countries, you've got a situation where there's a declining birth rate. So the indigenous population in the West is by and large having less than 2 children per family on average. So it's only something like 1.5. But now, if you've got a situation where you've got large people, you know, Muslims are having 12, 13 children in their families, they're flooding into the West. And in the West, people are only having on average 1.5 children per family, then you've got a situation where the Muslims are beginning to take over the West. And that is their aim and that is their target. Now, incidentally, while I'm talking about this, I mean, one of the things that the Muslims talk about is growth in Islam worldwide. Islam is a growing religion. Islam is only a growing religion because of the birth rate of Muslims. It's not a growing religion because of conversions. And I believe Prince Charles was actually said to a group of Christians, "Oh, I've been told there's a lot of Christians who are becoming Muslims." And it's like, no, there aren't Christians becoming Muslims. It's not happening. What's happening is there's a large number of Muslims that are coming over to Britain, and that's what's increasing the number of Muslims in Britain. But we've got to be wise as to what's going on. Because if we try and pretend that, oh, it doesn't matter, we don't know what's going on, it's not important, we'll just forget about it. We're just in the churches, we'll just focus on preaching the gospel. We'll ignore politics. We're missing out on a very important part of what God has called us to do. That's the important thing.
Keeping on the theme for a second about falling birth rates to 1.5, it's a lot lower in Spain and other countries. 30% of women between the ages of 18 and 35 do not want children. They prefer their careers. Let's enjoy ourselves, we're only young once, springs to mind. And as another axiom, let's leave it till we're in our 40s, because you can have babies later than ever because of medical science. Bit risky. There are not enough people supporting our own people, even supporting the general nation. This is one reason for letting the students in. And it's the legal amount of people coming into our country, not the illegals over the Dover Straits. It's the official ones that get the 4-year visas, don't bother having them extended, and stay in the country. That needs to be tackled.
Well, yes, it's interesting because a lot of these Muslim countries have got a lot of money. I mean, you're talking about the Gulf countries, they're all oil rich. So Saudi Arabia has a minister for exporting religion. They have a minister that is responsible for building mosques in Western countries. I mean, so this is not accidental. It's not like, okay, it's this is something that's happened, but it's just because poor people have left their countries looking for something better. It's something that it seems to be clearly happening deliberately. But you see, if we relate it to elections, the time has got to come when we as Christians in the West, in the UK in particular, rise up and realize we've got to vote and stand for our values of marriage between a man and a woman, our values of loving your neighbor, doing good to those who hate you, and so on and so forth. These are Christian values. Our values, indeed, of telling the truth and honesty, because there's nothing in Islam that talks about telling the truth. In fact, quite the opposite. It's a good thing to lie to disbelievers to gain an advantage. So the whole values of truth and honesty, of not stealing, I mean, in Islam, you're not allowed to steal from a fellow Muslim, but you can certainly steal from a Christian or any non-Muslim, and that's not a problem. So all these things, people don't realize that these are Christian values, but we've got to fight for them, honoring your father and mother. I mean, all these things, they're part of the Judeo-Christian heritage. And we're not going to be able to retain our values just by ignoring everything that's going on around us. We have to fight for Christian values. When I say fight, I don't mean engage in violence. I mean engage in elections and work hard.
Sid, we're talking about illegals coming across the channel. It's up 30-odd% this year on last year. Rishi seems to be completely either not interested or incapable of doing anything about it. Is it any surprise? Because the hidden thing here, of course, is ECHR. It's got to go. Everybody says with legal background, there's no way that this is going to go away on its own. You've got to get rid of ECHR because it'll come back. People will still remain in the country because they want to, and the European Court will allow them to do so. Now, of course, behind this is the civil service, who want ECHR more than anybody. Suella Braverman seems to be right.
Yeah, you see, but it's very interesting because I have to admit that in the past, I've always considered that the international institutions that we have are basically things that we should be committed to and work with. And by international institutions, I mean things like the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and indeed the European Court of Human Rights were things that we should work with, because human rights in the past, I mean, sort of talking now about 30 or 40 years ago, human rights was very much focused on the right not to be tortured, to the right to vote, the right to practice your religion in freedom, and so on and so forth. I mean, these were human rights. But over the last 10 years, human rights has completely changed.
In all this, of course, we've got Rishi, bless him, who apparently everybody says now he's not a politician. He's decided to come out with something this morning, a bit rare. He's hoping, or he's conceding, that there will be a hung parliament. Now, that's why he's not a politician. You don't do that anyway. But he's decided that it's a lost cause now. We're going to get a hung parliament. Let's make the best of it, because who do you think? Well, is it the Scots that are going to rule us? Is it the Greens that are going to rule us as kingmakers? It's a frightening prospect, but dear old Rishi is looking forward to it, or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. It looks as though John Sweeney is now going to be the new leader of the Scottish Nationalists, and it may well be that with Humza Yousaf off the scene, the Scottish Nationalists may get their act back together again, and they may get a lot more votes in Scotland than anticipated. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But the Labour Party were hoping for a big revival in Scotland, which may not happen. It's interesting. I mean, we've talked about it already, but, I guess it's very interesting what happened in Oldham, where the Labour Party lost seats. So the Labour Party are losing in some places, and there's no massive enthusiasm, which I found on the doorstep for the Labour Party. I mean, the prevailing feeling is more disillusionment. People are very disillusioned with the Conservative Party, and they're very disappointed that the Conservative Party haven't implemented Brexit properly and welcomed it with open arms as they should have done. Kemi Badenoch's done very well with her trade agreements, and she's a bright light, if you like, among the Conservative ministers. But others, like James Cleverly, have been totally useless. And some of the things going on now, which David Cameron is doing from the Foreign Office, is actually the opposite of what I think the people expected, was a Conservative government coming in elected under Boris Johnson. So I think people are very disillusioned because basically they haven't had what they voted for in 2019. So if people are disillusioned, it doesn't mean that they're going to swing back in large numbers to the Conservative Party. I think it's more likely that people are going to stay at home, or maybe even vote Reform UK. But then if the Conservative vote is greatly split, then obviously that will allow others in. But if the Labour vote is also split among George Galloway's New Workers' Party, among the Greens and the Lib Dems, if their vote is also split, then I think basically we're in a situation where there's still everything to fight for. But, the prevailing mode is disillusionment, not, let's bring the Labour Party back.
Yeah, back to politicians, I suppose. And I'm always struck. In fact, before we come on air, Sid, I've just been listening to a lady Labour politician being questioned about various things. And I've got to say, there is a great difference between politicians in the US and the UK. Because if you ask a politician in the US a question, he says yes or no. Now, he may go around the houses a bit, but he'll say yes or no. In the UK, no. It doesn't happen that way. We are past masters of avoiding the question, switching the subject straight away. And when people ask me, well, who should you vote for? What are the guidelines? And the first thing I always say is, do they answer straight questions, or do they swiftly go on to another subject? This Labour lady, shadow minister, was master of the arts, never answered one question. Is that a right way of looking at it, Sid? Do you answer questions straight?
Well, absolutely, we answer questions straightforwardly. I mean, if you see the interview that I did on BBC, every question they put to me, I just gave them a straightforward answer. I don't think you're right about the United States. I think the truth of the United States is that Trump answers questions, but Biden doesn't. I mean, I've looked at Trump's press conferences, and his press conferences, even though he can be very insulting sometimes to people that ask questions, he always, though, gives a direct answer. And you look, you what, and even now when he's asked questions, he gives direct, and even to the extent that the judges in courts are now trying to shut him up, because it's like, I'm not allowing you to say things like that, because it's like, well, I'm just telling the truth. I'm just telling you how it is. But Biden always avoids questions and avoided press conferences. When he's held press conferences, he's had a list of the reporters and a list of the questions they're going to ask and pre-prepared answers. Incredible that a politician, a president of the United States, should not be able to have a press conference where he doesn't know the questions in advance that are going to be asked. I mean, it's phenomenal, frankly. But that's what's going on. And there's numerous times when Biden's been asked questions, he's just completely avoided the question and just smiled and pretended he hasn't heard the question if he's not prepared for it. I mean, so the left are terrible at answering questions, and the Labour Party are absolutely terrible at answering questions. I mean, Angela Rayner, with her situation, is a typical example. I mean, she's now got into this problem with her with her housing situation, and she's been told, she's been given legal advice that she doesn't owe any money, but won't actually produce the advice. And every time she's asked a question, it's like, you shouldn't be asking me questions like this. I mean, it's now a police investigation underway, so we have to wait to see the results of the police investigation. But the point is, she's been incredibly secretive, and if she hadn't been secretive, there probably wouldn't be a police investigation, frankly. But Keir Starmer doesn't answer questions. They far prefer just to attack the Conservative Party and attack the government, whatever, than answer any question about their policy. That is the reality of it.
Well, if there is merit in what you're saying, Sid, if I hear another Labour person say, we've had 14 years of Tory rule. I mean, we know we have, but you don't say it every single interview, but they do. Is that all they can hang the coat on? Possibly. Let's move on, Sid. In one sense, we'll move on. The Labour Party will stick with just a little bit longer, because if they get back, when they get back, people will boldly say, we touched on this last week, they will take us back into the EU. That is the fear. They're already planning it, some people tell us. We're on our way already. They're rejoicing in Brussels already. How are we going to vote next time? Well, it appears at the moment, if we voted today, we'd go back into the EU, mainly because our young people will vote in very high percentages, even 90%, we are led to believe, in favour of going back into Europe. Now, nearly our young people led us into the era of Jeremy Corbyn. That was frightening. Some people are even saying, golly, the vote should be at age 25, even 35, when we've got some mileage under our feet, giving the young people a vote before they've really entered into the real working place.
Well, it's interesting. You see, I was with my daughter, my youngest daughter, yesterday, who is 35, And she was saying, I've gone through the process which a lot of people go through when they're in their 20s, they're idealistic and left wing. And then when they get older, they're conservative. She said, I'm going to vote conservative in the next election for the first time in my life, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, but I think a lot of people do go through that process. But one of the problems, of course, is left-wing teachers, left-wing university professors, and so on and so forth. I mean, we do need our young people to be able to face up to political issues and to have a proper and detailed discussion over what's going on and what people stand for. I mean, what Corbyn stood for was just complete nonsense. And also, by the way, since we're talking about the European Union, I mean, what the European Union stands for, frankly, is largely terrible. But you see, everything that the Remain side said during the last referendum has been proven false. I mean, we're going to lose 3 million jobs. Britain will become, will lose all the investments. London will cease to be a major financial centre. All the firms that are currently in the City of London will go elsewhere. They'll go to Paris or they'll go to Frankfurt. You know, London will simply disappear off the map as a financial centre. All these things that they've said have just been proven false. I mean, but instead of actually admitting, oh, we were wrong, they try and pretend that they were right. Oh, but we found a few firms that have left London and gone to Paris because of Brexit. Well, you know, there's certain movement of firms all the time. Of course there is, but the reality is that London, well, the last figures I saw, is still the largest financial centre in the world, bigger even than New York. I mean, although New York sometimes has figures bigger than London, but London is still always either number one or number two. But I believe the last time I looked, they were actually number one. And although Paris has gained to an extent, they're still way behind London in terms of the importance as an international financial centre. Now, believe you me, the EU, when we were part of the EU, didn't like the power of of London as a financial centre. They were trying to transfer business from London to Frankfurt, but it hadn't worked. But they were trying to put new regulation on the City of London in order to emasculate it, to basically force business out of London. That's what the EU was trying to do. So the EU was actually trying to destroy the City of London. And when we left the EU, they couldn't do it anymore. And London has thrived. That is the truth. Now, you see, unfortunately, media won't face up to the truth. Young people believe the BBC and believe what's on the media, but you know, so they just continue to propagate lies. Frankly, the truth is, there's no way that this country economically would benefit by going back into the EU. That is the truth.
Labour plots, I understand, to bring net zero to us through Ed Miliband. My goodness me, he's got somewhat of a mixed record, hasn't he? On a clampdown for companies. Now, this is very dangerous. He's got his ideas from Mark Carney. Say no more. We've got to keep global temperatures down to 1.5 degrees as per the Paris Agreement. Now, what's come about is that the directors of companies are going to be held personally responsible for their carbon footprint. Well, heaven help anybody like Shell, BP, or whatever, because they're straight in the firing line and they're keeping us going with electricity and gas rather than pie in the sky windmills, even to include, Sid, banks, because under new legislation planned through Ed Miliband, banks will not be allowed to lend to these companies who break the net zero rules as we approach 2050. Now, obviously, Chairman Mao's China springs to mind here, This is so dangerous. If this is, I nearly said, if this is socialism, give me communism. But it's one and the same thing, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think the thing which I find most difficult and indeed offensive, if I can use that term, about the whole climate agenda is the fact that we can't have a responsible academic discussion about climate issues because, as far as they're concerned, it's taken for granted that we've got a massive problem with man-made climate change. And unless we reduce our carbon emissions, then the world will be wiped out and destroyed, and then we no longer be human life on Earth. They take that for granted. And anyone that doesn't accept what I've just said is a climate denier and somebody who is not worthy to be on the media and must be completely silenced. Now, that's their agenda. And the problem with that agenda, because they control the media, it makes it very difficult to counter it. But this is where the truth comes in. The truth is that going to 100% battery cars doesn't work. There's enormous problems with battery cars. And there's a lot of people that have bought battery cars that are now wanting to go back to at least hybrids, if not purely petrol cars. There's problems with windmills because we're now finding that we've had windmills in place for 15 to 20 years, and then we're having to actually replace them. And we've got problems with recycling the windmills that we're pulling down because the windmill blades can't be recycled. So we've now got a problem, and we're finding that wind power only lasts 15 to 20 years before you have to replace the windmills. So that cost all has to be factored in. And then, of course, wind power at the moment can't be stored. So if you've got a situation where the wind isn't blowing, you're not getting any wind power. So you can't be 100% reliant on wind and solar. So you've got to have gas-fired power stations to back it up. And you've got or nuclear power stations to back it up. You've got to have other power stations to back up the wind power. And for every windmill that you have, there's got to be some sort of gas-fired power station somewhere or nuclear power station somewhere to back it up. That's the reality of what we're now accepting and realizing. And you see, the thing is, when environmentalists just quote, oh, but wind power we can get wind power at only 9 pence a therm or something, whereas a gas-powered power station produces power at 26p a therm, so wind power is far cheaper. They're not really producing true figures because they're not taking into account the cost of building these windmills and taking into account the costing of demolishing them after 15 to 20 years. So, we've got to look at the reality. And I'm sorry, we can't just, when it comes to these issues, talk about emotion only. We've got to look at reality and truth behind all these issues. And it's very dangerous if we just simply talk about, climate change as something that's accepted and truthful, and we can't debate with the right or wrong of it. In my mind, man-made climate change is not a given fact.
Well, there we are. There are more and more people realizing that's it. Let's move on, if we can, to something that's pretty close to what we've been saying regarding Ed Miliband, etc., and what's going to happen if when Labour get in power. And it is truly frightening because funding, one must presume, is going to be given to special interest groups. One of them is the climate change group, and they're going to be encouraged to come out and take out actions through the courts in the UK against said company directors of any company, whether it be FTSE 100 or not, that will break the rules and fall foul of the great aim of 2050. Now, if Labour is supporting this type of groups who regularly stick themselves to motorways and bridges, then they're culpable of being in league with the criminals.
Whether they're criminal or not is beside the point. I mean,
Well, they're breaking the law and they're criminals.
Well, you see, okay, you could say that these people feel strongly and they've got a right to protest and so on and so forth. But what's behind it is the whole issue of what is true and what is false. And if it's just an agenda and the agenda is a false agenda, then we've got to call it out for what it is. I mean, I've always been of the opinion, which I said at a meeting way back in 2015 at a hustings. I actually said, I've got no problem whatsoever with reducing pollution. I've got no problem with that. I've got no problem in reducing carbon emissions. If we can reduce carbon emissions, that's fine. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is the fact that the whole climate agenda is being used as an excuse for creating a one world government. And that is what is behind it. That's the reality of what's behind it. Because you see, obviously, you say, well, we can't solve the problems of climate with one nation working on its own. I mean, Britain has less than 1% of the worldwide carbon emissions. So however much Britain reduces its carbon footprint is going to have very little effect on the international climate. So they said, well, we've got to work as an international body to reduce climate emissions. And for that, we've got to have international bodies. We've got to have United Nations. But United Nations is in the hands of socialists. So they're in the hands of extremists, I'm afraid. That's the reality now. I mean, when we found out the United Nations was actually employing people from Hamas in Gaza and clearly controlled by Hamas in at least in some fields, you suddenly realize that United Nations is no longer a body we can trust at all. And the same applies to the whole climate issues. We cannot trust what they're doing. And that's the reality of it. So we've got, as Christians, we need to stand back and say, okay, what is true and what is false? And let's only hold on to what is true.
Indeed, Sid, we're as usual running out of time, but we've got two quick items to cover, which a lot of the viewers are looking forward to. Actually, I don't know. We've got one or two soccer fans in this country, and I've got two questions for you. And the two teams that really hate each other allegedly is not Rangers and Celtic; it's Liverpool and Manchester United. And it involves both those teams. And let's go to Liverpool and say Klopp has booed. He should never have told Liverpool he was off ski in January, because look what's happened. And the same thing could be alleged against Alex Ferguson, who gave the team 3 or 4 months' notice, even longer in his case, that he was going, he was retiring. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with Klopp, but it's certainly affected Liverpool, hasn't it?
I don't know. I mean, I think there was a move in Liverpool to try and give Klopp a really good send-off. But the reality is that, yes, the team has lost focus. And I think some of it revolves around Salah, who has suddenly started arguing with Klopp. So, see, when there's dissension in the ranks and people are pulling in different directions, then it's dangerous. And if you've got a player that somehow thinks that they're bigger than the team, then that's also very dangerous for the team as a whole. And I think that's the problem with Liverpool, not because Klopp is leaving. That's my opinion. Finding a good manager to take over somebody who has been a brilliant manager is always very, very hard. I remember when Matt Busby left Manchester United and they put in his deputy, Wilf McGuinness, and Manchester United were actually relegated afterwards, which that hasn't happened this time with Alex Ferguson leaving. And I don't think it'll happen with Liverpool, but it is a problem. And it'll be a problem, by the way, also for Manchester City, because I think there's a very good chance that Guardiola will leave Manchester City at the end of this season. I think he feels that project has probably come to an end, and it's time for him to move on to pastures new. And I know there'll be clubs all over the world that would love to have Guardiola as their manager and probably pay him very high wages. But if Guardiola leaves Manchester City, I think it'll be very difficult for Manchester City to find a good replacement.
Well,
So
they've got real problems. Perhaps, we look at United's problems, but with 155 potential charges being kicked over into the long grass, I think Pep's being very quiet and very clever, and he'll jump ship when this comes close to home. Actually, that would be a nice idea for Man U, wouldn't it? Oh, well, I can't see it happen, to get a manager just walking down the road to take over Old Trafford.
No, I don't think Guardiola will go to Manchester United. I think it's more likely he'll be looking for. Well, I think he could even look at Italy, frankly, because he's done brilliantly in Spain, he's done brilliantly in Germany, he's done brilliantly in the United Kingdom. I think the only country he's got left is Italy, frankly. And if there was a vacancy there and a club like AC Milan or Juventus, I think he'd love to go there and ply his trade in the Italian league. I think that's more likely what he would do.
Well, have you got any money, Sid? Because allegedly the whole of the Manchester United team are for sale. There's hope yet. Have we at last got somebody decent to run the club who sees the reality? Now, there are 2 or 3 players that will not be open for sale. They're the young ones coming through the youth movement. He wants to keep those, but even Rashford is up for sale if they ever get somebody that can afford his weekly, monthly, daily rate, which is frightening. It wouldn't happen in any other industry at all, Sid. If you perform badly, especially for 12 months, you're off ski. And there he is, sat on that wonderful contract, and he's not the only player. Money has become the death knell of so many clubs in the past, and looks like being so with Manchester United, unless Radcliffe can pull it round, get rid of the dissension in the dressing room that you've alluded to at Liverpool, and start from fresh.
Yes. I mean, see, one of the problems, of course, is selling players is that if they're on very high wages, another club can't just come in and buy the player and reduce the wages, because they're contracted already to pay those wages. So they've got to honour the existing contract and honour the existing wages. And when a player is not performing but is on very high wages, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them. This is what actually destroyed Leeds United, because Leeds United were a European team doing very well in the Champions League. And I think it was when they bought Robbie Fowler, actually, from Liverpool. He was on very high wages, and they bought this player on very high wages, and then he didn't perform as well as they'd hoped. And the club started going downhill, and all of a sudden they were just in a complete financial mess and ended up getting relegated and never really recovered. I mean, who knows? There's still a possibility that they could get promoted again this season, but they never really recovered from the financial mess that they were in. Manchester United were an extremely well-run club, for many, many years, with no debts at all, and managed extremely well. Of course, they've got probably a larger supporter base than any other club in the UK. So financially, they should be okay. They should be very well off. But, they've got to have people that make the right financial decisions. And you may well be right. Jim Radcliffe may well come in and make good financial decisions for the club. I hope so, because Manchester United should be one of the biggest clubs in Europe. And the way they're performing at the moment, they're not performing like it. So we'll have to wait and see.
We should congratulate ourselves, Sid, because we have broken 3 rules. With boldness, you should never talk about politics, you should never talk about religion, and you should never talk about football. But we've gone into the 3 no-nos, and we hope we've given you some thoughts. I'm addressing our viewers. Thank you so much, Sid. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.